So when looking at Russia right now, there is a particular theme and point in time that I keep returning to. I, like many Russian watchers, think about the relationship of previous leaders and their relationship to the country's identity and place in the world, but specifically one point most of all, that of Petrograd in 1917, when the then Tsar spent much of the First World War micromanaging troop movements, only then to disappear for long stretches and then emerge to make bizarre, out-of-touch public appearances, all the whilst his empire was quietly disintegrating around him. Indeed, Nicholas II didn't see it coming until it was all too late. Fast forward to now, and we have Vladimir Putin, who invokes the Tsars constantly, Katerina the Great of Novorossiya, or Peter the Great, most of all, and has spent 25 years building an image of himself as Russia's strongman heir to that imperial tradition. But this week he gave a damning state media interview with what he sounded much less like Peter the Great and a great deal more like that of Nicholas II. He said simply that right now we're observing a certain shortage, only quickly to clarify, though, that it's not critical. This is Vladimir Putin, at one point this most wealthy man in the world, but confirming what queues of furious drivers at petrol stations across Russia's oblast have been screaming on social media for weeks. And so I want to walk you through exactly why this admission matters so much more than you may think when you put it in the context of the broader picture, the historical context as well. Not because of what it says, but because of everything it reveals about the regime that has spent the best part of 4 years or 10 plus insisting that it could always absorb anything his way. This is The Global Gambit. How's it going, everyone? And welcome back to the channel, where we are returning to the Russia-Ukraine war, and specifically the latest around Russia and what Putin has said in some damning comments, and frankly, the biggest admission I can think of in recent memory that things are really not going well. Keep in mind that this is something I focus on often, being half English and half Russian, the language that Putin uses, what he admits versus what he hides, and so I'm curious what you guys think about this. Let me know in the comments. Now, let's be precise about what's happened in the past few days, because this admission by Putin is itself worth sitting with. For context, Putin was sitting at a meeting of senior officials from his own ruling party, the United Russia Party, and therefore the instrument of political power across the entire country. Putin said simply that you are well aware that problems for drivers and for businesses persist. Unfortunately, there are still lines at gas stations. End quote. In a separate interview on broadcast state TV, he went further than acknowledging Ukrainian strikes on critical infrastructure were, quote unquote, creating problems that's obvious. Now, this is not point blank how Putin talks. It's not really how I've ever seen him talk. He can occasionally be more blunt, but it's not usually in these contexts. For years, the Kremlin's domestic strategy has been built on a single premise: keep the war as far away from ordinary Russians as possible. No mobilization announcements unless forced. We saw what happened in late 2022 when a quote-unquote partial mobilization was done. No public acknowledgement of military setbacks unless unavoidable, and no admission of economic strain unless the alternative, which is silence in the face of visible reality, would be even more damaging. So this week, silence was no longer an option, because the refinery, the single largest fuel supplier to Moscow and the surrounding region, was hit twice by Ukrainian drones since the beginning of May. Now at least 17 other Russian oblasts have imposed mandatory restrictions on fuel sales. Dozens more are reporting shortages from private fuel companies, even without formal rationing. And then there's Crimea, where the situation has deteriorated to such a point that authorities have declared a state of emergency after strikes triggered widespread power outages alongside the fuel crisis. But what makes this even crazier is that Putin has even floated a total ban on diesel exports and announced that Russia is now drawing down its strategic gasoline reserves, telling officials he expects July production to exceed June's. That is not the leader, therefore, of someone managing a minor inconvenience. That is the language of a government actively trying to prevent a controlled problem from becoming an uncontrolled one. Now, let's take a step back, because to understand why Putin felt compelled to say anything at all, you need to understand the scale of what Ukraine has been doing, because the headlines do undersell it considerably. Now, one such estimation puts Ukrainian joins reducing Russian refining capacity by 700,000 barrels a day. The International Energy Agency reported that Russian crude oil production dropped around 5% year on year last month, specifically because of these strikes, and described the disruption as, in their words, unprecedented in the history of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Other analysts estimate more than a quarter, a fifth, 20 to 25% of Russia's total refining capacity is offline. So this is not isolated to the front line. The Antipinski refinery in Tyumen, Western Siberia, for example, which converts around 160,000 barrels of oil into fuel daily, has been struck twice this month. It's more than 1,000 miles. Now, that's more than 1,000 miles from anywhere near the fighting. Facilities far away as Vladivostok and Sakhalin on Russia's Pacific coast have started investing in anti-drone defenses just as a precaution. And so there is now effectively nowhere inside Russia's vast territory that feels insulated from this campaign. And this symbolism has been, of course, deliberate. On the opening morning of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, the event the Kremlin uses every year to project economic strength and this bastion of safety, well, Ukrainian drones turned up uninvited to strike several terminals across the city. Guests arriving for the conference would watch back, seeing black smoke rising over the skyline before they'd even taken their seats. Then, 3 days later, and again on June 20th, the Antipinski refinery was hit a second and third time. Days after that, strikes hit an oil storage facility roughly 1 kilometer from the Crimean side of the Kerch Bridge, the only direct land connection between Russia and Crimea, which shut down traffic across it entirely, of which there was a vast array trying to evacuate Crimea because of the state of emergency. So you see, quite simply, that these are not unconnected events. This is a deliberate, sustained, but expanding campaign from Ukraine. And Putin's own central bank governor, Iveria Nabiullina, has warned of high inflation and what she called almost permanent economic deterioration, adding that Russia is facing a labor shortage unprecedented in modern Russian history, driven substantially by the staggering human cost of this war. Because while we can get focused on the explosions and the large-scale shifts in economic policy or impacts on our fuel and daily cost of living, this is, of course, against the backdrop of the mass casualties that are nearly incomprehensible. The director of British intelligence, for example, has cited a new piece indicating that Russian war deaths have likely reached over 500,000. Various other sources place total Russian casualties above 1 million when including the wounded or missing. By some accounts, Russia is losing 8 men killed or seriously wounded for every one Ukraine does. According to even Russian military bloggers, virtually the last thing for any resembling free expression left in the country, the average life expectancy of a new recruit from arrival at a training camp to death in combat is somewhere between 10 days and 3 weeks. That's not a Western source, that's Russian sources, just to remind you. So once actually deployed to the battlefield, that works out to the average survival time being around 30 minutes. To keep replacing those losses then, Russia is now offering signing bonuses as high as $80,000 to $140,000, and still recruitment is struggling to keep pace with the casualties. This is now the structural trap Putin is caught inside. Military spending accounts for roughly half of Russia's entire state budget, significantly more than the Kremlin has ever publicly admitted. And that's according to German or Swedish intelligences, which put it starkly, as I've heard any Western official put it, the Russian economy can only enter one of two scenarios now: long-term decline or complete shock. Either one leads to financial disaster. Cutting military spending will collapse the only part of the economy still generating growth, but continuing to spend at the current rate accelerates the very economic deterioration that is now visibly cracking the surface. There is no version of this that doesn't hurt for Putin, and I made it very clear that we could see this happening back in February. It's now almost 6 months since then. But what makes this moment even more genuinely different from previous difficult periods in the war is now how openly it is admitted. Some anonymous business people have told Western outlets that everybody is furious, that everyone, regardless of their class or income or education, are seeing that the growing realization that utter senselessness, self-destructive decisions keep being made, and that ultimately you're losing and an entire generation of especially young men, but most of all, of course, in Russia, to a completely stupid war. This is not Western commentary. Again, this is not Ukrainian propaganda. These are people inside Putin's not only most educated, but his own economic class, the people whose loyalty has underwritten his entire political system for 25 years, speaking, although anonymously, in terms that would be unthinkable even a year ago. And Putin seems to be responding in the way that cornered regimes will do, by squeezing and extracting more from the people closest to him, rather than simply admitting the structural problems. This month, for example, the Kremlin confiscated assets worth more than 7 billion from the founder of Rusagro, Vadim Moskovich. Russian oligarchs have reportedly made what they are describing as voluntary contributions to the war chest, expected to run to roughly 4 billion by the end of the year. And there are persistent rumors that Nabulina herself, the central bank governor, whose warnings have been increasingly blunt, may be pushed out for telling the Kremlin things it doesn't want to hear. Elite solidarity is one thing, but reaching directly into their pockets is something else entirely. It tends not to go unnoticed by people whose money is being taken, which brings us all back to where I started this video. While Ukrainian drones are hitting Lukoil refinery in Perm, Putin chose that moment to talk publicly about sauerkraut recipes. When he wanted to demonstrate he wasn't simply hiding from public view, he turned up at a Moscow hotel to collect his old schoolteacher for dinner, a gesture seemingly intended to project warmth and normality and personable touch, than instead read to most of all leaders as a leader profoundly not only disconnected from the scale of what is actually happening, but largely in denial. Putin spends much of his time now deliberately out of sight. Visitors face considerably more stringent security checks. Indeed, he has increased his own security by another 100 personnel. And so this is a leader who, by every available account, is increasingly isolated, even more than he was in COVID, emerging occasionally only to make statements that land as strange rather than reassuring senses of words. That is precisely the pattern that preceded the collapse of the Romanov dynasty in 1917. Not a single dramatic moment of failure, but a slow accumulation of disconnection between a leader convinced of his own command of the situation and a population that could see with their own eyes that something had fundamentally broken. A frustrated Russian blogger recently asked the question, sort of saying, are we heading to something like 1917? Now, you have to also think that the only time that Russia has actually gone through significant moments of change is revolution. Now, whether or not we can say that we're seeing a modern state of revolution in 2026, say like we did in 1991 over the White House, not so sure. I think the more relevant question is whether Russian experiences a dramatic implosion. It's whether enough cracks accumulate at the top of the system that factions within Moscow begin concluding it's time for a different direction again. But this is what concerns me most with where this is heading. Whenever Putin has felt cornered throughout this war, his instinct has consistently been escalation rather than acceptance or retreat. At the end of May, Lavrov warned the US they could use systemic and sustained strikes on facilities in Kiev and advised Western countries to evacuate their staff. Of course they didn't. But after a Russian drone struck an apartment block in Romania, a NATO state, Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, warned European states they should simply get used to such incidences, telling them that citizens of the EU should expect not to be sleeping peacefully. Putin has formally revised Russia's nuclear doctrines a couple of years ago, lowering the threshold for nuclear use and explicitly stating that aggression by a non-nuclear state backed by nuclear power would be considered reasonable enough grounds for Russia to retaliate. And then Russia and Belarus conducted their own joint exercises again, including the explicit use for nuclear weapons just in May. Now, none of this should be read as Russia preparing to actually use nuclear weapons. Saber rattling is frequent, a sign of diminishing leverage rather than growing strength. But others note that Putin appears keen to expand the battlefield through any other means, be them sabotage, cyber attacks, arson, and specifically across Eastern European nations. In psychology, this is called drowning man syndrome, where a swimmer in genuine difficulty doesn't calmly tread water. He pushes everyone near him under the surface in a desperate attempt to stay afloat himself. And as Russia's problems compound over the summer, the refineries, the fuel queues, the casualties, the economic contraction, the temptation for Putin to widen this conflict rather than de-escalate it appears to be growing rather than shrinking. Putin himself, unsurprisingly, has framed all of this as an unprecedented Western pressure designed to destabilize Russia internally. In his words, that Russia will not be and cannot be defeated on the battlefield. This emphasis that Russia will not submit in the face of adversity, and something that runs through the minds and perspectives of Russians very deeply. But compare that to Zelensky, who has made it clear that this pressure campaign is intentional and only going to continue, approving on June 25th a 40-day operation by security services to, quote, influence the aggressor in order to push for an end to this war. Putin now having to admit that this effort by Ukraine is working, however uncomfortable, and therefore puts him in a difficult position with no easy way out. The war is now financially, politically, and most sadly, demographically unaffordable, and will have consequences for both countries, but seemingly especially Russia, for decades. He is, in the most literal sense, caught between two scenarios that lead to the same destination: financial disaster and possibly the end of his leadership. Or shall we just be more honest, reign. Nicholas II didn't believe that his empire at the time could collapse until the moment it did. This week, while Ukrainian drones are striking yet another Russian refinery, the president of Russia does exactly the same, and seemingly is barely in touch with the very Russians he promised he would protect and help uplift in the great resurgence of Russia, the great power. This is not strength. That is the sound of a regime running out of room to maneuver, and a leader who spent 25 years into power, well, finally discovering, much too late, the way these things usually go, exactly how the story of Nicholas II actually ended. But that's it from me, everyone, with this latest update. Let me know what you guys think. I'm trying a little bit something different with the way I'm reading my videos. I'm drafting scripts and trying to present my thoughts to you. And if you enjoyed it, then of course, like the video and subscribe for more unique conversations with top tier guests. We'll see you all in the next one. Take care.